The sun hung low over Alexandria, its golden rays painting the city in hues of amber and bronze. The Nile, a ribbon of life winding through the desert, shimmered in the distance, its waters whispering secrets to those who dared to listen. The air was thick with the scent of papyrus and incense, mingling with the salty tang of the Mediterranean. Alexandria was alive, a city of scholars, merchants, and dreamers, where the ancient and the modern collided in a symphony of chaos and wonder. Stood on the balcony of the royal palace, my fingers tracing the intricate carvings of Isis on the stone railing. The goddess's eyes seemed to follow me, her gaze piercing through the veil of time. I was Cleopatra, daughter of the Nile, queen of a kingdom that had stood for millennia, but today I felt less like a queen and more like a pawn in a game I did not fully understand. My brother, Ptolemy III, had exiled me from the throne, his advisors whispering poison into his ears. They called me a threat, a woman too ambitious for her own good. Perhaps they were right, but I was not one to bow to the whims of men, no matter how powerful they believed themselves to be. "My queen," a voice called from behind me. Soft, yet firm. I turned to see Neith, the priestess of Isis, her dark robes flowing like shadows around her. Her eyes, sharp and knowing, held a glimmer of something I could not quite place. Fear, perhaps, or anticipation. "Neith," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging within me. "What news do you bring?" She stepped closer, her gaze flickering to the horizon. "Caesar has arrived in Alexandria," she said, her tone low and urgent. "He seeks an audience with the rulers of Egypt." My heart quickened. Julius Caesar, the man whose name echoed across the known world, whose ambition knew no bounds. He was a conqueror, a strategist, a man who had turned the tides of war with a single word. And now he was here, in my city. "What does he want?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Neith hesitated, her fingers tightening around the amulet of Isis that hung from her neck. "He seeks to secure Egypt for Rome," she said. "But there is more. The oracle of Siwa has spoken." I raised an eyebrow, my curiosity piqued. The oracle of Siwa was no mere fortune-teller. Her prophecies were said to be the whispers of the gods themselves. What did she say? Neith's voice dropped to a whisper, as though the very walls might betray us. "The fate of empires rests in the hands of the daughter of the Nile. Her choice will echo through eternity." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I felt a chill run down my spine, though the sun still warmed my skin. A choice. My choice. But what did it mean? "What choice?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. Neith's gaze met mine, her expression unreadable. "That is for you to discover, my queen, but know this. The path you choose will shape not only Egypt's destiny, but the fate of the world itself." I turned back to the balcony, my mind racing. The Nile stretched before me, its waters a mirror to the heavens. Somewhere beyond its banks, Caesar waited, his presence a storm on the horizon. I could feel the weight of the prophecy pressing down on me, a burden I had not asked for but could not ignore. "What would you have me do, Neith?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She stepped beside me, her presence a calming force amidst the turmoil in my heart. "I cannot tell you what to choose," she said, "but I can guide you. There is an artifact in the temple of Isis, a golden scarab. It is said to show visions of what could be, of paths not yet taken. Perhaps it will help you see the truth." I nodded, though my thoughts were a whirlwind. A golden scarab. Visions of the future. It sounded like the stuff of legends, but then so did I. "Very well," I said, squaring my shoulders. "Take me to the temple." As we left the palace, the city buzzed with life around us. Merchants hawked their wares, children laughed in the streets, and the distant hum of the Library of Alexandria whispered promises of knowledge and power. But I could not shake the feeling that this was the calm before the storm. The Temple of Isis loomed before us, its towering columns casting long shadows in the fading light. The air inside was cool and heavy with the scent of myrrh. Neith led me to a hidden chamber, its walls adorned with hieroglyphs that seemed to shift and dance in the flickering torchlight. At the center of the room, on a pedestal of black stone, sat the scarab. It was smaller than I had imagined, no larger than my palm, but its surface gleamed with an otherworldly light. As I reached for it, a jolt of energy shot through my arm, and the world around me dissolved into darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the temple. I stood on a battlefield, the air thick with the clash of swords and the cries of the dying. Before me stood Caesar, his armor bloodied, his eyes blazing with fury. Behind him the Roman legions marched, their banners flying high. But this was not the present. This was a vision, a glimpse of what could be. I turned, and there, amidst the chaos, I saw myself. Not as I was now, but as I could become. A queen, powerful and unyielding, her eyes filled with a fire that could not be extinguished. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the vision faded, and I was back in the temple, the scarab warm in my hand. "What did you see?" Neith asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. I looked at her, my mind still reeling from what I had witnessed. "I saw a choice," I said slowly. "A choice that could change everything." Neith nodded, her expression grave. "Then you must decide. My queen, will you embrace Caesar and secure your throne, or will you forge your own path no matter the cost?" I clenched the scarab in my hand, its edges digging into my palm. The weight of the prophecy pressed down on me, but for the first time I felt a glimmer of clarity. This was not just about Egypt, this was about the world. And I, Cleopatra, daughter of the Nile, would not be a pawn in anyone's game. "Prepare my ship," I said, my voice firm. "I will meet Caesar on my own terms." As we left the temple, the scarab pulsed faintly in my hand, a silent reminder of the choice that lay ahead. The gods were watching, and the fate of empires hung in the balance. But I was no longer afraid, I was ready. The scarab pulsed faintly in my hand as I stepped onto the ship, its golden surface warm against my skin. The night was alive with the sounds of the harbor, waves lapping against the docks, the distant hum of sailors preparing their vessels, and the occasional cry of a gull cutting through the darkness. The air was thick with the scent of salt and seaweed, a reminder that the sea, like fate, was both a giver and a taker. Neith stood beside me, her robes billowing in the breeze. Her presence was a comfort, though her silence spoke volumes. She had said little since we left the temple, her gaze fixed on the horizon, as though she could see the threads of destiny unraveling before her. "Are you certain this is the path you wish to take?" she asked finally, her voice barely audible over the creak of the ship's timbers. I glanced at her, my grip tightening on the scarab. "I am certain of nothing," I admitted, "but I cannot sit idle while my kingdom crumbles. If Caesar is the key to securing my throne, then I will use him as he intends to use me." Neith's expression was unreadable, but I thought I saw a flicker of approval in her eyes. "Then let us hope the gods are on your side," she said. The journey to Caesar's camp was short but tense. The ship cut through the waves like a blade, its sails catching the moonlight as we approached the Roman encampment. The sight of their banners, emblazoned with the eagle of Rome, sent a shiver down my spine. These were not mere soldiers. They were the instruments of an empire, and their presence on Egyptian soil was a threat I could not ignore. As we disembarked, a group of Roman soldiers approached, their armor gleaming in the torchlight. Their leader, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, eyed me with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "State your business," he demanded, his voice sharp and commanding. I straightened, my chin lifted in defiance. "I am Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt," I said, my voice ringing with authority. "I seek an audience with Julius Caesar." The soldier's eyes widened, and he exchanged a glance with his comrades. For a moment I thought he might refuse me, but then he nodded and gestured for us to follow. The camp was a maze of tents and fortifications, the air thick with the sounds of clanging metal and shouted orders. The Romans moved with precision, their discipline a stark contrast to the chaos of Alexandria. I could feel their eyes on me as we passed, their whispers following us like shadows. At the center of the camp stood a large tent, its entrance flanked by guards. The soldier leading us approached one of them, speaking in low tones before stepping aside to allow us entry. Inside, the tent was opulent, a stark contrast to the austerity of the camp. Rich tapestries adorned the walls, and the air was heavy, with the scent of incense. At the far end of the room, seated at a table strewn with maps and scrolls, was Julius Caesar. He looked up as we entered, his piercing gaze locking onto mine. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. "Cleopatra," he said finally, his voice smooth and measured. "I had not expected to see you here." I stepped forward, my head held high. "And yet, here." "I am," I replied. "I have come to discuss the future of Egypt." Caesar leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing on his lips. "The future of Egypt," he repeated. "And what, pray tell, do you propose?" I took a deep breath, my mind racing. This was the moment I had been preparing for, the moment that would determine the fate of my kingdom. "I propose an alliance," I said, my voice steady. "Egypt is rich in resources and knowledge, but we are vulnerable. With Rome's support, we can secure our borders and ensure our prosperity." Caesar's smile widened, but there was a calculating gleam in his eyes. "And what would Rome gain from such an alliance?" I met his gaze without flinching. "A loyal ally in the East," I said, "access to the wealth of the Nile, and the gratitude of a queen who does not forget her friends." For a long moment Caesar said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "You are bold, Cleopatra," he said. "I admire that, but boldness alone is not enough to secure an alliance. What guarantees can you offer?" I hesitated, my mind racing. I had anticipated this question, but the weight of it still pressed down on me. "I can offer you my loyalty," I said finally, "and my word as queen." Caesar studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Very well," he said. "We shall discuss the terms of our alliance. But know this, Cleopatra, Rome does not take kindly to betrayal." I inclined my head, my heart pounding in my chest. "Nor does Egypt," I replied. As the negotiations began, I could feel the scarab pulsing faintly in my hand, a silent reminder of the choice I had made. The gods were watching and the fate of empires hung in the balance. But as I sat across from Caesar, my mind was already racing ahead, plotting the next move in this dangerous game. For I knew that alliances, like empires, were built on shifting sands, and I would not be caught unprepared. The negotiations with Caesar stretched late into the night, the air in the tent growing heavy with tension and the scent of burning oil. From the lamps, maps of Egypt and Rome lay scattered across the table, their edges curling from the heat. Caesar's generals stood at attention behind him, their eyes sharp and calculating, while Neith remained at my side, a silent but ever-watchful presence. The terms of the alliance were laid out with precision, each word weighed carefully. Caesar demanded access to Egypt's grain stores, a steady supply of gold, and the use of Alexandria's harbor for Roman ships. In return, he offered military support to secure my throne and protect Egypt from external threats. But as the discussions wore on, I began to see the cracks in his promises. His words were smooth, his tone confident, but his eyes betrayed his true intentions. He spoke of partnership, but his gaze lingered on the maps of Egypt's fertile lands, his fingers tracing the Nile as though it were already his. "And what of my brother?" I asked, breaking the rhythm of his speech. "Ptolemy, 30 still holds Alexandria. How do you propose to remove him?" Caesar leaned back in his chair, his smile never wavering. "Leave that to me," he said. "Rome has ways of dealing with inconvenient rulers." The implication hung in the air, cold and unspoken. I felt a flicker of unease, but I masked it with a smile of my own. "Then we are in agreement," I said, though the words tasted bitter on my tongue. As the final terms were sealed, Caesar rose from his seat, extending his hand to me. "To a prosperous alliance," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. Took his hand, my grip firm. "To Egypt's future," I replied, my tone measured. The moment the agreement was made, the scarab in my hand pulsed faintly, a reminder of the visions I had seen in the temple. I excused myself, citing the need for rest, and stepped outside into the cool night air. Neith followed, her expression unreadable. "You feel it too, don't you?" I asked, my voice low. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "The gods are restless," she said. "The balance of fate has shifted. Your choice has set something in motion, Cleopatra, something we cannot yet see." I clenched the scarab tighter, its edges digging into my palm. "What do you mean?" Nith turned. To me, her eyes dark with foreboding. "The visions you saw in the temple, they were not mere possibilities. They were warnings. The path you have chosen will lead to great power, but also great peril. The gods do not take kindly to those who meddle with fate." I frowned, my mind racing. "Then what would you have me do? Abandon the alliance? Leave Egypt to its fate?" Nith shook her head. "I cannot tell you what to do, my queen, but you must be prepared for the consequences of your actions. The scarab is a tool, but it is also a burden. Use it wisely." Before I could respond, a commotion broke out in the camp. Shouts echoed through the night, and the sound of clashing. Swords filled the air. I turned to see Roman soldiers rushing toward the perimeter, their weapons drawn. "What's happening?" I demanded, my heart pounding. One of Caesar's generals approached, his face grim. "Ptolemy's forces have launched an attack," he said. "They've breached the outer defenses." I exchanged a glance with Neith, my mind racing. Ptolemy's timing was no coincidence. He must have learned of my meeting with Caesar and decided to strike before the alliance could be solidified. "We must act quickly," I said, my voice firm. "If Ptolemy takes the camp, all is lost." Nith nodded, her expression resolute. "Then let us show him the strength of Egypt." As the battle raged around us, I found myself at the center of the chaos. The scarab pulsed in my hand, its light growing brighter with each passing moment. I could feel its power coursing through me, a strange and unfamiliar energy that sharpened my senses and steadied my resolve. In the distance, I saw Ptolemy's forces advancing, their banners flying high. At their head was my brother, his face twisted with rage. He had always been impulsive, but this was madness. "Cleopatra," he shouted, his voice carrying over the din of battle. "You think you can betray me and live? I will see you dead, before the night is over." I stepped forward, my head held high. "You are the one who betrayed me, brother," I called back. "You exiled me, stole my throne, and now you seek to destroy me. But I will not let you." The scarab's light flared, and for a moment the battlefield fell silent. The air grew heavy and the ground beneath my feet seemed to tremble. I could feel the eyes of the gods upon me, their presence a weight that pressed down on my shoulders. Then, with a roar, the battle resumed. Ptolemy's forces charged, but they were met with a wall of Roman steel. Caesar's soldiers fought with a discipline and ferocity that turned the tide, driving Ptolemy's men back. In the chaos, I lost sight of Ptolemy, but as the fighting began to subside, I saw him again, his sword raised high as he charged toward me. "Cleopatra!" he screamed, his voice filled with hatred. I stood my ground, the scarab's light blazing in my hand. As Ptolemy closed the distance, I raised the scarab, its light engulfing him in a blinding flash. When the light faded, Ptolemy was gone. The battlefield fell silent, the soldiers on both sides staring in shock. Even Caesar looked stunned, his usual composure shattered. What did you do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked down at the scarab, its light now dim. "I did what I had to," I said, my voice steady. But as the reality of what had happened sank in, I felt a chill run down my spine. The scarab had saved me, but at what cost? Nith stepped forward, her expression grave. "The balance has been disrupted," she said. "The gods will not ignore this." I nodded, my heart heavy with the weight of my actions. The path I had chosen was fraught with danger, but there was no turning back now. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, I turned to Caesar. "The alliance stands," I said, my voice firm. "But know this, Egypt is not yours to a command. I am its queen and I will protect it with everything I have." Caesar studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. "As you wish, Cleopatra," he said. "But remember, Rome does not forget." As the camp began to recover from the battle, I felt the scarab pulse faintly in my hand, a silent reminder of the choices I had made. The gods were watching, and the fate of empires hung in the balance. But I was no longer afraid. The scarab lay silent in my hand, its golden surface dull and lifeless. The battle was over, Ptolemy was gone, and the alliance with Caesar stood firm. But as I stood amidst the ruins of the camp, the weight of what I had done pressed down on me like the stones of the pyramids. Neith approached, her robes stained with dust and blood, her expression unreadable. "The gods are watching," she said, her voice low and solemn. "Your choice has set something in motion, Cleopatra, something we cannot yet see." I nodded, my gaze fixed on the horizon, where the first light of dawn was breaking. "I know," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging within me. "But I cannot turn back now. Egypt's fate is in my hands, and I will not falter." Neith studied me for a moment, her eyes filled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "Then let us hope the gods are merciful," she said. As the days turned into weeks, the alliance with Caesar proved to be both a blessing and a curse. His soldiers helped secure Alexandria, driving out the remnants of Ptolemy's forces and restoring order to the city. But with their presence came the heavy hand of Rome, their influence seeping into every corner of my kingdom. I worked tirelessly to maintain Egypt's independence, using every ounce of my cunning and charm to keep Caesar at bay. But the scarabs, warning lingered in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of the price I might yet have to pay. One evening, as I stood on the balcony of the palace, Neith approached with a scroll in her hand. "A message from the Temple of Isis," she said, her tone grave. "The priests have seen omens in the stars. They speak of a great upheaval, a shift in the balance of power." I took the scroll, my fingers trembling slightly as I unrolled it. The words were written in the ancient script of the priests, their meaning clear. "The daughter of the Nile has chosen her path, but the gods demand their due. The scales of fate must be balanced." I looked up at Neith, my heart heavy with dread. "What does it mean?" She hesitated, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "It means that your choice has consequences, Cleopatra. The gods will not allow the balance of fate to be disrupted without retribution." Before I could respond, a messenger arrived, his face pale and his breath ragged. "My queen," he said, bowing low, "Caesar has been summoned back to Rome. There is talk of rebellion, of plots against his life." I felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly extinguished by the weight of the prophecy. Caesar's departure might buy me time, but it would not save me from the gods' wrath. As the weeks turned into months, I focused on rebuilding Egypt, using the resources and knowledge of my people to strengthen our borders and secure our future. The Library of Alexandria became a beacon of learning, attracting scholars and philosophers from across the known world. But even as Egypt flourished, I could not shake the feeling that something was coming, something I could not yet see. Then, one night, the scarab pulsed faintly in my hand. Its light flickering like a dying flame, I knew what it meant. The gods were calling. I made my way to the Temple of Isis, the air thick with the scent of incense and the sound of chanting priests. Neith awaited me at the entrance, her expression grave. "It is time," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. What must I do? She led me to the hidden chamber where the scarab had first shown me its visions. The air was heavy with the weight of the divine, the walls adorned with hieroglyphs that seemed to shift and dance in the flickering torchlight. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, its surface carved with the symbols of the gods. Neith gestured for me to place the scarab on the pedestal, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and anticipation. I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for the scarab. But I knew there was no turning back. I placed it on the pedestal, the golden surface gleaming in the dim light. The moment the scarab touched the stone, the room was filled with a blinding light. I felt a surge of energy, a force that seemed to pull me into the very fabric of time. When the light faded, I found myself standing in a vast empty plain, the sky above me filled with swirling clouds and the distant sound of thunder. Before me stood the gods, their forms towering and majestic, their eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "Cleopatra," a voice boomed, shaking the very ground beneath my feet. "You have disrupted the balance of fate. The scales must be balanced." I fell to my knees, my heart pounding in my chest. "I did what I thought was right," I said, my voice trembling. I sought to protect my people, to secure Egypt's future. The gods were silent for a moment, their gaze piercing through me like a blade. Then one of them stepped forward, his form shifting and changing until he stood before me as a man, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and resolve. "You have chosen your path," he said, his voice softer now. "But every choice has consequences. The balance of fate must be restored." I nodded, my heart heavy with the weight of his words. "What must I do?" The god studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he reached out, his hand resting on my shoulder. "You must bear the weight of your choices," he said. "The fate of empires rests in your hands, Cleopatra. The gods will not intervene again." With that, the vision faded, and I found myself back in the temple, the scarab lying silent on the pedestal. Neith stood beside me, her expression filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "It is done," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my heart heavy with the weight of what I had seen. "The gods have spoken," I said. "The balance of fate must be restored." As I left the temple, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon, the sky painted in hues of gold and crimson. I knew that the path ahead would be fraught with danger, but I also knew that I could not falter. Egypt's fate was in my hands, and I would not let it fall.